In this video, we'll talk a little bit about a common approach people take when evaluating research claims. As critical consumers of evidence, I think it should be obvious now that we should be skeptical about what we hear about research claims. The steps to critical thinking that we've talked about tell us that we have to evaluate for ourselves whether we think claims are true or not. But we should be careful because there are some people that are really gullible and they just believe anything they hear. But there are also people who just don't believe anything they hear, even when the evidence can be pretty overwhelming. Both of these approaches are bad, so just always take a step back to make sure you aren't believing everything you hear, but make sure you also don't just reject everything either. Being a critical consumer of evidence is more than just disagreeing with people. And doing this can be hard. With all studies, and there's no exception to this, there will always be shortcomings. Some researchers will list out their study's limitations, but others you'll kind of have to figure it out for yourself. So you have to remember to put these things into context. Some limitations will be really minor and they won't really challenge the findings at all. Some limitations can be bigger and maybe can call into question the findings of some research. And other limitations can be really obvious and fatal to a research study. This quote says, "The scientist must be alert to what is importantly wrong. It is inappropriate to be concerned with mice when there are tigers abroad." Put things into context and remember that you don't always need to get bogged down into all the minor details of a study when something bigger could be out there. And it definitely takes practice to be able to do this and identify this. So the best practice is just to keep reading scientific articles and you'll slowly begin to pick up on this stuff. So you've all probably watched this show Mythbusters. In this show, they go and test common assumptions or myths and test if they're true or not. If you haven't seen it, it's worth checking out, but it's kind of based on this flawed premise. I mean, how do you exactly bust a myth? So let's take an example of the myth, Bigfoot is real. How would you bust this myth? Well, you would have to go out and find Bigfoot. If you fail to find Bigfoot, this means that you just don't have evidence that he exists, and this leaves open the possibility that he actually does exist. So you can only prove the myth by finding him. You can't disprove this myth. Let's take another example, dropping pennies off of skyscrapers that could kill people. You would bust this myth by dropping pennies off of skyscrapers. Even if you don't kill anybody, it's still possible that someone could die from this. So like the Bigfoot example, you can only prove the myth, which is by killing people. You cannot disprove the myth. Maybe a better title for Mythbusters would be Failing to Find Support for Myths While Allowing for the Possibility that Evidence in Favor of the Myths Exists. And this is pretty much the logic of null hypothesis significance testing, what we use to test claims in research. With this, we start with a null hypothesis that there's no effect of an independent variable. And we keep this null hypothesis until we find evidence to the contrary. Evidence of an alternative hypothesis that there is an effect of an IV means that we now reject the null hypothesis. But failing to find evidence of the alternative hypothesis is just a failure to reject the null hypothesis. It's always possible that evidence for something might still exist out there somewhere. So it's important to keep in mind that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. In the NHST framework, you can't really prove the null hypothesis. Failing to find evidence of the alternative or research hypothesis still leaves the possibility that the evidence exists somewhere. But even when you do find evidence and therefore reject the null hypothesis, this isn't full proof of something. We learned previously about type 1 error, and this NHST framework still allows the possibility of finding an effect when it doesn't actually exist. So overall, you can't bust myths. You can only find evidence for or against myths, and you should always allow for new evidence in the future. The case is never really closed, and it's this reason why in scientific writing we try and avoid using the terms like prove or proof. Okay, so if you haven't seen Mythbusters before, here's your chance. I want you all to pause this video and open up this link in another tab and watch that video. You'll watch this short Mythbusters clip and we'll see if we can try to critically evaluate it. Specifically, let's look for some key elements like the independent variable, the dependent variable, what design they used, and what their hypothesis was, and any potential confounds. So go ahead and pause the video now and go open up the URL in a separate tab. And once you're done, resume this video and we'll talk about it on the next slide. Okay, so now that you've watched the short Mythbusters clip, let's talk about it. So they had women rate the attractiveness of men with job descriptions next to their image. The independent variable in that experiment was the type of job, whether it was more of a high status job or a lower status job. The dependent variable was the ratings that the women provided of the men. And the design they used was a between subjects design. They had separate groups of women rate the low and high status groups separately. So there were a couple of good things about this video. They kept their stimuli consistent, which was good. They used the same photos in both groups and only manipulated the job descriptions. And they found that women gave higher attractiveness ratings for men with higher status jobs, which actually agrees with the scientific research out there. But there were some cons, and some cons from this video. They didn't really do a literature review at all. If they had, they would know that there's actually a ton of research on this area, and it's not really a myth at all to begin with. So if they had done their previous research, they wouldn't have even needed to do this experiment. They also did a poor job of group testing. They were asking people what their ratings were and tried to explain themselves in front of everyone. This could have totally influenced other women's ratings of other images. So there was a complete lack of control over what the testing environment was. They also didn't use the best type of design. When you want to test increases or decreases in things like attractiveness, for example, it's better to use a within subjects design. This gives you more power and provides you ratings from both groups from everyone, not just half of your sample. And the last thing is a really minor note, but their description of evolutionary theory wasn't exactly the best. So anyway, that's just one example of things to look for whenever you look at evidence and research. So that's it for this video, and we'll see you next time.